Ma'am, I said empty your purse, everything out, now. Yvonne Sinclair's hands remained steady as she placed each item on the metal table. Wallet, keys, phone, while Warden Preston Whitmore watched with narrowed eyes, his arms crossed like he was enjoying a show. You people always think the rules don't apply to you, Preston muttered to his deputy, loud enough for Yvonne to hear. Strip search her. Sir, that's not standard protocol for... Did I stutter, Matthews? I said strip search. This one looks like trouble. The 34-year-old Inspector General of Ohio said nothing, mentally cataloguing every word, every violation, every illegal procedure they were about to subject her to. Preston had no idea he was digging his own grave with every racist command. Let me guess. Preston stepped closer, his voice dripping with contempt. Visiting your baby daddy, your drug dealer boyfriend? Which cell block am I directing you to today, sweetheart? Yvonne met his gaze with calm dignity. She could end this humiliation with 2 words, State Inspector, but she needed to see how deep this corruption ran. Answer me when I'm talking to you, Preston snapped, his face reddening. Who exactly do you think you are to just walk into my facility and... Warden Whitmore. Yvonne's voice cut through his rant like ice. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather badge wallet. I'm Yvonne Sinclair, State Inspector General. This is an unannounced compliance inspection. The color drained from Preston's face as she flipped open her credentials. And you've just given me enough evidence to shut this place down. The morning sun cast long shadows across the razor wire of Riverside Correctional Facility as Yvonne Sinclair's black sedan pulled into the visitor parking lot. She sat for a moment, adjusting her navy blazer and checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her appearance was deliberate, professional but not flashy, authoritative but not intimidating. Today's inspection would determine the fate of Ohio's most controversial prison. As the State Inspector General, Yvonne had conducted dozens of surprise inspections, but something about the reports she'd been receiving from Riverside made her stomach tighten. Complaints of racial discrimination, excessive force, and systematic mistreatment had been piling up on her desk for months. Today, she would see the truth firsthand. The facility's exterior was imposing. 30-foot concrete walls topped with coils of razor wire. Guard towers manned by officers with high-powered rifles. But it was what happened inside these walls that concerned her most. Yvonne locked her car and walked toward the main entrance, her heels clicking against the asphalt. She'd deliberately chosen not to announce this inspection. The element of surprise was crucial for gathering authentic evidence of any misconduct. The front entrance was sterile and unwelcoming, reinforced glass, metal detectors, and cameras monitoring every angle. The sign read, "All visitors subject to search," in bold red letters. Yvonne approached the reception desk, where a heavy-set guard with Matthews on his nameplate looked up from his paperwork. "Morning. I need to begin the visitor registration process," Yvonne said calmly. Deputy Warden Kyle Matthews barely glanced at her before sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out completely. No abbreviations. Print clearly." As Yvonne completed the form, she noticed how Matthews' demeanor had subtly shifted when he saw her. His initial professional courtesy had been replaced by a more suspicious, scrutinizing look. She made her first mental note of the day. "Purpose of visit?" Matthews asked, not looking up from her completed form. "I'm here to conduct an official inspection," Yvonne replied honestly, though she didn't specify her authority level. Matthews finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Inspection? What kind of inspection?" "You from the health department? Fire marshal?" "State oversight," Yvonne answered, keeping her response vague to observe their standard procedures. That's when Warden Preston Whitmore emerged from the inner office, drawn by the word inspection. At 52, Preston was an imposing figure, 6'2", silver hair, and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from 25 years in corrections. His uniform was crisp, his posture military straight, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to absolute power. "What's this about an inspection?" Preston's voice carried the tone of a man who didn't like surprises. Matthews gestured toward Yvonne. "This lady says she's here for some kind of state inspection." Preston's gaze traveled from Yvonne's face to her professional attire, lingering in a way that made his assumptions clear. In his mind, he was already categorizing her. Another bureaucrat, probably from some bleeding heart oversight committee, here to waste his time with political correctness. State inspection, huh? Preston's smile was cold. And what exactly qualifies you to inspect my facility? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Yvonne could have ended the charade right there, could have produced her credentials and watched Preston's arrogance crumble. But she needed to see how he operated when he thought he held all the power. I have the proper authority, she replied calmly. Preston's laugh was harsh. The proper authority, right. He turned to Matthews. Run her through full screening protocol, and I mean full protocol. Matthews nodded, though something in his expression suggested he knew this wasn't standard procedure for state officials. Ma'am, you'll need to go through our security screening process, Matthews said, his tone becoming more formal and less friendly. As Yvonne was directed toward the metal detector, she caught Preston whispering to another guard who had joined them, Mason Sterling, whose nameplate identified him as Captain of Security. Whatever Preston said made Mason grin and nod. The metal detector beeped as Yvonne walked through, even though she'd removed all metal items. Step back through, Mason ordered. Remove your jacket. I've already removed all metal items, Yvonne said calmly. Ma'am, when the detector goes off, we follow protocol. Remove the jacket. Yvonne complied, folding her blazer neatly and placing it in the plastic bin. She walked through again. Another beep. Jewelry, Mason said, pointing to her simple gold wedding ring and small pearl earrings. As she removed these items, Yvonne noticed that a white man who had entered after her was being waved through the same metal detector without any additional screening, despite the detector remaining silent for him. But what Preston didn't realize would change everything. The jewelry removal was just the beginning. As Yvonne stood in her blouse and slacks, Preston approached with the swagger of a man who believed he was in complete control. So, Miss, he paused, making a show of consulting her visitor form, Sinclair, exactly what department did you say you were from? I didn't specify a department, Yvonne replied, maintaining her professional composure despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Preston's eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Oh, you didn't? How convenient. He turned to his staff with an exaggerated expression of confusion. Boys, we have ourselves a mystery inspector here. Won't tell us what department she's from, but she has proper authority to inspect my facility. Guard Captain Mason Sterling chuckled, falling into Preston's intended dynamic. Maybe she's from one of those civil rights groups, boss. You know how they like to come in here and tell us how to do our jobs. Civil rights, huh? Preston's tone grew more condescending. That would make sense. They always send people who look like... He gestured vaguely at Yvonne. Well, like they have a personal agenda. Yvonne felt the familiar burn of institutional racism, but her expression remained neutral. As Inspector General, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to maintain her composure, while mentally documenting every violation of professional conduct. Mr. Whitmore, she said, deliberately not using his title, I'd like to begin the inspection process now. The slight, addressing him as Mr. instead of Warden, was not lost on Preston. His jaw tightened slightly. Oh, you'd like to begin, would you? His voice carried a dangerous edge. Well, Miss Sinclair, this is my facility, and we do things my way. You don't just walk in here and start making demands. Preston turned to Mason and Matthews, his voice deliberately loud enough for other staff members who had begun gathering to overhear. You know what I love about these state people? They think their little clipboards and attitude give them authority over men who've been keeping the peace in places like this for decades. Several guards nodded and murmured agreement. Yvonne noted how quickly the group dynamic had shifted to an us versus her mentality, with Preston clearly positioning himself as the alpha defending his territory. Matthews, what's our policy on unscheduled inspections? Preston asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Well, sir, legitimate state inspections are typically scheduled through the administrative office with proper documentation and... Exactly, Preston interrupted. Proper documentation, which our visitor here seems to be lacking. Yvonne reached into her purse, which was still sitting on the security table. I do have proper documentation. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Mason stepped forward, his hand moving to his radio. Ma'am, you need to ask permission before reaching into your belongings during a security screening. I was simply retrieving my identification, Yvonne explained. Your identification or something else? Preston's implication was clear and deeply offensive. In my experience, people who are evasive about their credentials usually have something to hide. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Several guards exchanged glances, and Yvonne could see how Preston's attitude was influencing their behavior toward her. This was exactly the kind of toxic leadership culture that generated the complaints she'd been receiving. Sterling, I think we need to be extra thorough with our security screening today, Preston announced. Can't be too careful with uninvited guests. Understood, sir, Mason replied, his tone suggesting he was enjoying this power play. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step into the private screening room for additional security measures, Mason announced. Yvonne knew this was far beyond standard protocol. She'd visited dozens of correctional facilities, and never had she been subjected to this level of scrutiny, especially not before presenting her credentials. Additional security measures for what purpose? She asked. Preston stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. The purpose, Miss Sinclair, is that this is a maximum security correctional facility, not some office building downtown. We don't take chances with people who show up making vague claims about authority they can't or won't verify. The white visitor, who had entered after Yvonne, was now being escorted directly to the visiting area, after a cursory check of his ID. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical, except there was nothing funny about the systematic discrimination she was witnessing. I see, Yvonne said quietly, making another mental note. And this level of screening is standard for all visitors. It's standard for visitors who concern us, Preston replied, his meaning unmistakable. What she witnessed next would become crucial evidence. The private screening room was a windowless concrete box with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on the grey walls. A single metal table sat in the center, flanked by two plastic chairs that had seen better days. The room smelled of disinfectant and fear, the kind of place where dignity went to die. "Have a seat," Mason Sterling commanded, gesturing to one of the chairs while he and another guard, Officer Jackson, positioned themselves near the door. Yvonne remained standing. I'd prefer to complete this process as quickly as possible and begin my inspection. Mason's laugh was humorless. Lady, you're not in any position to make preferences. Sit down. Through the small window in the door, Yvonne could see Preston conferring with Matthews and several other staff members. Their body language suggested they were enjoying this situation far more than professional corrections officers should. Before we proceed, Yvonne said calmly, I'd like to understand the legal basis for this extended screening. What specific security concern justifies these measures? Officer Jackson, a younger man who seemed less comfortable with the situation, glanced nervously at Mason. Sir, maybe we should just— Jackson, shut up, Mason snapped. Then to Yvonne, the legal basis is that Warden Whitmore has absolute authority over security in this facility. You don't like it, you can leave. I see. And does Warden Whitmore's authority extend to violating state inspection protocols? The question was delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone that Mason paused, uncertainty flickering across his face for just a moment before his bravado returned. Look, Princess, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but— The door opened and Preston entered, his presence immediately filling the small space. He carried a clipboard and wore the expression of a man who was thoroughly enjoying himself. Sorry to keep you waiting, Miss Sinclair, he said with false courtesy. I've been reviewing our protocols for unusual situations. Unusual situations? Well, yes, you see, we don't often get visitors who refuse to properly identify themselves while claiming to have inspection authority. Preston pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements deliberate and theatrical. It's the kind of situation that requires careful handling. Yvonne finally sat, not out of compliance, but to better observe the power dynamic Preston was trying to establish. She noted how he positioned himself across from her like an interrogator, how Mason and Jackson flanked the door like guards, how the entire setup was designed to intimidate and diminish. Now then, Preston began, consulting his clipboard, let's start with some basic questions. What's your full name? Yvonne Marie Sinclair. Address? Yvonne provided her home address in Columbus, which Preston wrote down with exaggerated care. Employer? The state of Ohio. Preston looked up sharply. The state of Ohio is a big place, Miss Sinclair. What department? Executive branch. Preston's pen stopped moving. Executive branch. You work for the governor. I work for the people of Ohio. The evasiveness was intentional. Yvonne wanted to see how far Preston would push before she revealed her true authority. Every moment of this interrogation was building her case against him. Very philosophical, Preston said dryly, but I need specifics. What's your job title? I conduct oversight inspections of state facilities. Oversight inspections. Preston leaned back in his chair. And what qualifies you to conduct these inspections? What's your background? This was where things got interesting. Yvonne's background was impeccable. J.D. from Ohio State, 15 years in Corrections Administration, 5 years as Deputy Inspector General before being appointed to the top position by the governor himself. But she wasn't ready to play that card yet. I have the necessary qualifications, she replied. Preston's facade of professional courtesy began to crack. Miss Sinclair, I'm trying to be patient here, but your evasiveness is starting to concern me. People with legitimate authority don't typically play word games. People with legitimate authority also don't typically subject state officials to interrogation, Yvonne countered smoothly. The room fell silent. Preston's face reddened slightly, and Mason shifted uncomfortably by the door. Even Jackson seemed to sense that the dynamic was more complex than they'd initially assumed. Preston leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more menacing level. Let me be clear about something, Miss Sinclair. This is my facility. These are my men. You are currently a guest here, and that status can change very quickly if you continue to be uncooperative. The threat was unmistakable and completely inappropriate for any legitimate security screening. Yvonne filed it away with all the other violations she was witnessing. Uncooperative, she asked. In what way have I been uncooperative? I've answered your questions, submitted to your security screening, and allowed myself to be brought to this room. What exactly would cooperation look like to you, Warden Whitmore? But the worst was yet to come. Preston's eyes narrowed dangerously. The use of his title, delivered with just enough emphasis to be almost mocking, clearly irritated him. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor with a harsh screech that echoed in the small room. Cooperation, Miss Sinclair, would look like honesty. It would look like respect for the authority structure here. It would look like understanding that you're not in some downtown government office where you can throw around vague titles and expect people to bow down. Yvonne remained seated, her posture calm and professional despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. I see. And what has given you the impression that I don't understand where I am? Your attitude, Preston snapped. Your whole demeanor. You walk in here like you own the place, making demands, questioning our procedures. That tells me you don't understand the reality of what we deal with here. Mason Sterling stepped closer to the table, his hand resting on his radio in a gesture that was clearly meant to be intimidating. Ma'am, the warden is trying to be reasonable here. Maybe you should consider adjusting your approach. The tag team intimidation was textbook abuse of authority, and Yvonne was documenting every word, every gesture, every violation of professional conduct, but she needed more. She needed to see the full extent of their misconduct before revealing her hand. My approach, Yvonne asked. What exactly is problematic about my approach? Preston walked around the table, positioning himself behind her chair. Another classic intimidation tactic. What's problematic is that you seem to think your background gives you some kind of special privileges here. The pause before background was loaded with implication, and everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. My background? Yvonne turned slightly in her chair to maintain eye contact. What about my background concerns you? Preston's smile was cold and calculating. Let's just say that in my experience, people from certain communities often have unrealistic expectations about how they should be treated in facilities like this. The barely veiled racism was so blatant that even Officer Jackson looked uncomfortable. Mason, however, seemed to be enjoying the show. Certain communities, Yvonne repeated flatly. Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by that? I think you know exactly what I mean, Preston replied, his voice taking on an edge that suggested he was losing patience with the verbal sparring. This was the moment Yvonne had been waiting for, the moment when Preston's racism moved from subtext to text, from implication to explicit statement. But she needed him to say more, to make his prejudice absolutely undeniable. Actually, Warden Whitmore, I'm not sure I do understand. Could you be more specific about which communities you're referring to and what unrealistic expectations they typically have? Preston's jaw worked silently for a moment, clearly wrestling with how much of his true thoughts he wanted to voice. The room was thick with tension, and Yvonne could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. Look, he finally said, moving back around to face her directly. I've been doing this job for 25 years. I've seen every type of person walk through those doors. And in my experience, people like you, urban, educated, probably never set foot in a place like this before, you come in here with these preconceived notions about how we operate. People like me, Yvonne said quietly, letting the phrase hang in the air. Yes, people like you. You read some report, hear some complaint from some inmate's family member, and suddenly you think you're an expert on corrections. You think you can waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs. Mason nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly right, sir. They don't understand the reality of what we face every day. Preston was warming to his theme now, his voice gaining confidence as his staff reinforced his position. The reality is that this facility houses some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. Murderers, rapists, gang members, and we keep them in line through discipline and respect for authority. Not through social work and sensitivity training. The speech was revealing on multiple levels. It showed Preston's fundamental misunderstanding of modern corrections philosophy, his disregard for rehabilitation and human dignity, and most importantly for Yvonne's purposes, his willingness to make assumptions about her competence based on her race and gender. So when someone like you comes in here questioning our methods, Preston continued, it undermines everything we've built. It sends the wrong message to both the inmates and my staff. Someone like me, Yvonne repeated again, her tone still neutral but with an undercurrent that suggested she was filing away every word. Yes, Preston said firmly. Someone who doesn't understand that this isn't some corporate boardroom where everyone gets a participation trophy. This is the real world, where actions have consequences and authority means something. The door to the screening room opened, and Deputy Warden Matthews peered in. Sir, there's a situation in Block C that needs your attention. Preston glanced at his watch, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Handle it, Matthews, I'm not finished here. Sir, well, it might be better if you... I said handle it. Preston's voice cracked like a whip, and Matthews immediately stepped back. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. As Matthews hurried away, Preston turned back to Yvonne with renewed focus. Now, Miss Sinclair, I think we've danced around this long enough. I want to see some identification, real identification. Not some business card or letter of introduction, but official government ID that proves you have the authority you claim. Yvonne reached slowly into her blazer pocket, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel the leather wallet containing her Inspector General credentials, could imagine the look on Preston's face when he saw them. But not yet. She needed one more push, one more statement that would make his prejudice absolutely undeniable. Before I show you my identification, she said quietly, I'd like you to explain exactly why you believe I don't have the authority I claim. Preston's patience finally snapped. Because people like you don't have real authority. You have titles, you have positions, but you don't have the knowledge or the backbone to make the hard decisions that keep places like this running. What happened next would expose the truth that would destroy everything Preston thought he knew about power. The silence that followed Preston's outburst was deafening. Even Mason Sterling, who had been egging on his boss throughout the interrogation, seemed to realize that the warden had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yvonne sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, mentally cataloguing not just Preston's words but the way he had delivered them, the venom in his voice, the aggressive posture, the complete abandonment of any pretense of professionalism. In her 15 years of corrections work, she had seen many examples of institutional racism, but rarely had she witnessed such a blatant display from someone in a position of ultimate authority. "People like me don't have real authority," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That's your professional assessment?" Preston, perhaps realizing he had revealed too much, attempted to backtrack. "What I mean is—" "No, please continue. I'd like to understand your perspective fully." Yvonne's voice remained calm, almost encouraging. "What is it about people like me that makes you believe we lack the knowledge and backbone for positions of authority?" The trap was perfectly set. Preston could either admit his statement was racially motivated, or he could dig himself deeper by attempting to justify it. His face flushed red as he struggled with his options. Mason cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Sterling," Preston snapped. His composure completely shattered now. He turned back to Yvonne, his finger pointing accusingly. "You want to know what I think? I think you're exactly the kind of bleeding-heart liberal who's destroying the correction system in this country. All theory, no practice, all complaints, no solutions." "Bleeding-heart liberal," Yvonne noted. "Is that assessment based on my professional qualifications or something else?" Preston's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Professional qualifications? Lady, I don't care if you have a dozen degrees and a briefcase full of certifications. You can't learn what I know from a textbook." "And what is it that you know, Warden Whitmore?" "I know that some people belong behind bars, and some people belong in positions of authority. I know the difference between leaders and followers. I know who has what it takes to maintain order in a place like this." The implications were crystal clear, even if Preston was trying to avoid explicitly stating them. Yvonne had heard this type of coded language countless times throughout her career. The suggestion that certain types of people were naturally suited for positions of power, while others were not. "I see," she said quietly. "And you've determined which category I fall into based on our brief interaction?" Preston's smile was condescending. "Miss Sinclair, I've been reading people for 25 years. I can tell within 5 minutes of meeting someone whether they have what it takes to handle real responsibility." "Real responsibility," Yvonne repeated. "Like running a state correctional facility?" "Exactly like that. This job requires someone who can make tough decisions, someone who can command respect from both inmates and staff, someone who understands that sometimes you have to choose between being liked and being effective." Officer Jackson, who had remained silent throughout most of the interrogation, finally spoke up. "Sir, shouldn't we just verify her credentials and—" "Jackson, when I want your opinion, I'll ask for it," Preston snarled. Then to Yvonne, "You see, that's what I'm talking about. Jackson there, he's young, he's inexperienced. He thinks everything can be solved with proper procedures and forms. But leadership isn't about following rules. It's about knowing when to break them." The statement was so problematic from a legal and ethical standpoint that Yvonne almost smiled. Preston was essentially admitting that he believed his authority gave him the right to violate established procedures whenever he saw fit. "Knowing when to break rules," she said. "Can you give me an example of when that might be appropriate?" Preston leaned against the wall, his posture suggesting he was settling in for a longer conversation. Clearly, he had decided that Yvonne was no real threat, and was now enjoying the opportunity to lecture her on his philosophy of corrections management. "Perfect example," he said, "is what we're doing right now. By the book, I should have just checked your ID and either admitted you or turned you away. But my instincts told me something was off about you, so I decided to dig deeper." "Your instincts told you something was off," Yvonne said. "What specifically triggered those instincts?" Preston's hesitation was brief, but telling. "Experience. Like I said, 25 years of reading people. So it wasn't my appearance, my manner of speaking, or any other observable characteristic." "It was everything," Preston said, waving his hand dismissively. "The way you carried yourself, the way you talked, the whole package. It all added up to someone who was trying to be something she wasn't." The beauty of Preston's response was that he thought he was being clever, avoiding explicit racial language while making his meaning perfectly clear. But to someone with Yvonne's training and experience, his coded language was as obvious as if he had used slurs. "I see," she said. "And in your 25 years of experience, have you found that your instincts about people are generally accurate?" "Damn right they are," Preston said proudly. I can spot troublemakers, con artists, and wannabe authorities from a mile away. Little did they know they were digging their own graves. As Preston continued his self-congratulatory lecture, Yvonne's mind was working on multiple levels. On the surface, she maintained her calm, professional demeanor, asking probing questions and allowing him to dig himself deeper into a hole of his own making. But underneath, her years of training and experience as Ohio's Inspector General were cataloging every violation, every breach of protocol, every example of discriminatory conduct. The Ohio Inspector General position wasn't just a title. It was the highest oversight authority in the state, with the power to investigate misconduct in any state agency, including the Department of Corrections. Yvonne had been appointed to the position by Governor Patricia DeWine herself, after serving 5 years as Deputy Inspector General and 10 years in various Corrections Administration roles. Her qualifications were impeccable, her authority was absolute, and her reputation for thorough, fair investigations was legendary throughout state government. But more than that, Yvonne understood the system from the inside. She had started her career as a corrections officer, worked her way up through the ranks, and had seen every type of abuse of power that Preston was now demonstrating. She knew that what she was witnessing wasn't just personal prejudice. It was systemic discrimination that likely affected every aspect of how this facility operated. "Warden Whitmore," she said, interrupting his monologue about the importance of trusting gut instincts over procedural requirements. "How long have you been in charge of this facility?" 8 years as warden, 25 total in corrections, Preston replied proudly. "And in those 8 years, how many complaints have been filed against the facility regarding staff conduct?" Preston's expression shifted slightly. "Complaints? We get complaints all the time. Inmates complain about everything, the food, the temperature, the color of the walls. It's part of the territory." "I'm not referring to inmate complaints about conditions," Yvonne clarified. "I'm asking about formal complaints regarding staff misconduct, particularly involving discriminatory treatment." The question hit its mark. Preston's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "We handle all complaints through proper channels," he said carefully. "The Department of Corrections has established procedures." "I'm familiar with the procedures," Yvonne interrupted gently. "I'm asking about the number and nature of complaints specifically involving your facility." Mason Sterling shifted uncomfortably near the door, and Officer Jackson was now looking openly concerned. Both men seemed to be realizing that this conversation had moved beyond a simple security screening into territory that could have serious professional consequences. Preston, however, was too invested in his position of authority to back down. "Look, Miss Sinclair, if you're here because someone filed a complaint, then you should know that we investigate every allegation thoroughly and take appropriate action when necessary." "Someone filed a complaint," Yvonne repeated. "Actually, Warden Whitmore, there have been 17 formal complaints filed against this facility in the past 18 months. 12 of them specifically alleged discriminatory treatment based on race. Are you familiar with those complaints?" The color drained from Preston's face. 17 complaints was a staggering number for any correctional facility, and the fact that Yvonne knew the exact count suggested she had access to information that went far beyond what a typical inspector would possess. "We respond to all complaints according to established protocols," Preston stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Established protocols," Yvonne nodded. "And what do those protocols require when a pattern of discriminatory conduct is identified?" The room fell silent. Mason and Jackson exchanged worried glances, and even Preston seemed to realize that he was no longer in control of this conversation. "A pattern?" Preston tried to regain his footing. "I wouldn't characterize isolated complaints as a pattern. 17 complaints in 18 months, 12 specifically alleging racial discrimination filed by visitors, family members, inmates, and staff. Would you characterize that as isolated incidents?" Preston's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The specific nature of Yvonne's knowledge was clearly shocking to him, and for the first time since she had arrived, he seemed to understand that he might be facing someone with real authority. "How do you—" he began, then stopped himself. "How do I know about the complaints?" Yvonne asked. "That's an excellent question, Warden Whitmore. Perhaps this would be a good time for me to properly introduce myself." She reached into her blazer and withdrew a leather credential case, moving slowly and deliberately so that everyone in the room could see exactly what she was doing. "My name is Yvonne Marie Sinclair," she said, flipping open the case to reveal her official Inspector General badge and identification. "I am the Inspector General for the state of Ohio, appointed by Governor DeWine and confirmed by the state Senate. I am here conducting an unannounced compliance inspection of this facility with full authority under Ohio Revised Code Section 121-47 to investigate any and all aspects of operations, management, and staff conduct." The silence that followed was profound. Preston stared at the credentials as if they might transform into something less threatening if he looked at them long enough. Mason Sterling's hand fell away from his radio, and Officer Jackson took an involuntary step backward. "Inspector General," Preston whispered, the words barely audible. "That's correct," Yvonne said, closing the credential case and returning it to her jacket. "And everything that has transpired in the last 45 minutes, every question you've asked, every assumption you've made, every procedure you've violated, has been witnessed and documented by the highest oversight authority in Ohio's correctional system." The truth was about to explode in ways no one expected. Preston's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally, desperate calculation. Mason Sterling looked like he might be sick, while Officer Jackson appeared to be mentally reviewing every word he had spoken since entering the room. "Inspector General," Preston repeated, his voice stronger now as he attempted to regain some semblance of control. "Well, that changes things, of course. If you had identified yourself initially—" "If I had identified myself initially," Yvonne interrupted smoothly, "I wouldn't have witnessed the systematic violations of professional conduct, discriminatory treatment, and abuse of authority that have characterized my experience here today." She stood slowly, her movement commanding the attention of everyone in the room. At 5'6", she wasn't physically imposing, but her presence now filled the space in a way that made the concrete walls seem to shrink around the three men. "Let me be clear about what I have observed and documented during this unannounced inspection," she continued, her voice taking on the formal tone of someone delivering an official report. "Beginning at approximately 9:15 a.m., I was subjected to discriminatory treatment based on my race, including but not limited to excessive and inappropriate security screening, interrogation tactics designed to intimidate rather than verify credentials, and explicitly racist commentary about my qualifications and authority." Preston's mouth moved soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. The confident, domineering warden who had entered this room was gone, replaced by a man who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his situation. "Furthermore," Yvonne continued, "I observed preferential treatment given to white visitors who entered the facility after me, including expedited processing and waived security requirements that were insisted upon for me." Mason stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Ma'am, Inspector General, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "Captain Sterling," Yvonne's voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade, "are you about to suggest that your participation in this discriminatory treatment was based on a misunderstanding?" Mason's mouth snapped shut. The use of his rank made it clear that Yvonne knew exactly who he was and what his role had been in the morning's events. "Because if that's your position," she continued, "I should inform you that I have perfect recall of your specific contributions to this situation. Would you like me to repeat them verbatim?" The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Mason shook his head quickly. "Good," Yvonne said. "Now, Officer Jackson, I noticed that you seemed uncomfortable with several aspects of this morning's proceedings. Is that accurate?" Jackson looked nervously between his superiors and the Inspector General, clearly torn between loyalty to his chain of command and his own professional survival. "Yes, ma'am. Some of the procedures seemed irregular." "Irregular," Yvonne repeated. "Can you be more specific?" Preston finally found his voice again. "Jackson, you don't have to—" "Warden Whitmore," Yvonne's voice was sharp enough to cut glass, "are you instructing a member of your staff not to cooperate with an official investigation?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Everyone in the room understood that obstruction of an Inspector General investigation was a career-ending offense at minimum, with potential criminal implications. No, Preston said quickly. Of course not. Jackson, answer the Inspector General's questions. Jackson swallowed hard before speaking. The extended security screening wasn't standard protocol for official visitors. The private screening room is typically used only for visitors who trigger specific security alerts, and the questioning seemed more like an interrogation than a verification process. Thank you, Officer Jackson, Yvonne said. Your honesty is noted and appreciated. She turned back to Preston, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. Warden Whitmore, I want to be absolutely clear about what happens next. This inspection will continue and it will be thorough. I will be examining not just the incidents of this morning, but the culture and practices that made them possible. Preston nodded weakly, all of his earlier bluster completely deflated. I will be reviewing all 17 discrimination complaints filed against this facility, examining your responses to those complaints, and investigating whether the patterns I observed today are representative of broader systemic issues. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. But first, I want you to understand something, Warden. When you looked at me this morning, you saw what you expected to see, a black woman who you assumed was beneath your consideration. Your assumptions about my background, my qualifications, and my authority were based entirely on your prejudices. Preston started to speak, but Yvonne held up a hand to stop him. The irony is that I actually do have the background you claimed I lacked. I started as a corrections officer 20 years ago, worked every position from the ground up, earned my law degree while working full-time, and spent 15 years in corrections administration before being appointed Inspector General. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only did Yvonne have the authority Preston had questioned, she had more practical corrections experience than he did. So when you questioned whether people like me have what it takes to handle real responsibility, she continued, you were actually speaking to someone who has handled more responsibility in corrections than you ever will. If you typed respect during this incredible moment of truth being revealed, let us know in the comments below. Your support means everything as we share these powerful stories. What came next would shock everyone in the building. As Yvonne's words settled over the room like a verdict, Preston finally understood the full scope of his catastrophic miscalculation. This wasn't just about a morning of poor judgment. This was about the systematic destruction of everything he had built over 8 years as warden. Inspector General Sinclair, he began, his voice hoarse with desperation, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred this morning. Misunderstanding? Yvonne's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that how you characterize what happened here? Preston's hands were visibly shaking now as he realized that his attempt to minimize the situation was only making things worse. What I mean is, if my actions or words were interpreted as discriminatory in any way, that was never my intention. Your intention, Yvonne repeated slowly. Warden Whitmore, let me share with you some of the specific comments you made this morning, and you can help me understand what your intentions were. She pulled out her phone and opened a notes app, though the truth was she didn't need to reference anything. Every word was burned into her memory with perfect clarity. At 9:23 a.m., you told Deputy Matthews that people like this always think the rules don't apply to them. At 9:31 a.m., you stated that people from certain communities have unrealistic expectations. At 9:47 a.m., you explicitly told me that people like you don't have real authority. Each quote hit Preston like a physical blow. The specificity of the times, the exactness of the wording. It all painted a picture of someone who had been professionally documenting violations from the very beginning. These weren't misunderstandings, Warden. These were deliberate acts of discrimination by the person in charge of this facility. Mason Sterling, who had been silent since his earlier attempt at explanation, suddenly spoke up. Inspector General, I want you to know that I was just following orders. The warden instructed us to— Captain Sterling, Yvonne interrupted. Following orders is not a defense for participating in discriminatory conduct. You're a sworn officer with your own professional responsibilities. The reminder that Mason had his own accountability sent him back into silence, but the damage was done. His willingness to throw Preston under the bus in order to save himself revealed the toxic leadership culture that had allowed this morning's events to unfold. However, Yvonne continued, your cooperation with this investigation will be noted in my report. She turned back to Preston, who looked like a man watching his world collapse in real time. Warden Whitmore, in addition to the discriminatory treatment I personally experienced, I observed several other serious violations. You instructed your staff to conduct procedures that exceeded standard protocol without cause. You created an intimidating environment designed to discourage legitimate oversight. And perhaps most seriously, you demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of your role and responsibilities as a state employee. Preston's last-ditch attempt at damage control came tumbling out in a rush of words. Inspector General, I've dedicated my entire career to public service. I've run this facility without any major incidents. The safety record here is exemplary. If I made some mistakes in judgment this morning, I'm willing to accept appropriate discipline and additional training. Stop, Yvonne said quietly, but with such authority that Preston's mouth snapped shut immediately. Do not insult my intelligence by suggesting that systematic discriminatory conduct can be corrected with training. She walked to the small window in the door and looked out at the facility beyond. The concrete corridors, the locked doors, the carefully controlled environment where thousands of people lived under Preston's authority. This facility houses 2,400 inmates, she said without turning around. 68% of them are people of color. They are under your care, your authority, your protection. If this is how you treat a professional black woman conducting an official inspection, how do you treat the inmates under your supervision? The question hung in the air like an indictment, because everyone in the room knew the answer. How do you treat their families when they come to visit? How do you treat your own staff members who don't look like you? How do you make decisions about discipline, medical care, rehabilitation programs? When she turned back around, her expression was one of professional disappointment rather than anger, which somehow made it more devastating. Warden Whitmore, the culture of discrimination I witnessed today doesn't exist in isolation. It permeates every aspect of how this facility operates, and it starts at the top. Preston made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Inspector General, I understand that you're upset about this morning, and you have every right to be. But I hope you'll consider my overall record, the complexity of running a facility like this, the pressures we face every day. I will consider everything, Yvonne said firmly. Every complaint filed against this facility, every decision you've made as warden, every policy you've implemented, every culture you've created. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. But Warden Whitmore, I want you to understand something. This isn't about me being upset. This is about systemic failures in leadership that have created an environment where discrimination is not only tolerated, but actively practiced by the person in charge. The consequences were about to become terrifyingly clear. The door to the screening room opened, with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the entire facility. As Yvonne stepped into the corridor, followed by three men whose careers had just been irreparably altered, the atmosphere in the administrative wing changed palpably. Deputy Warden Matthews, who had been hovering nearby since Preston's dismissal of his earlier interruption, took one look at the group emerging from the screening room and immediately understood that something catastrophic had occurred. Preston's face was ashen, Mason looked like he might vomit, and Officer Jackson appeared to be in a state of shock. But it was Yvonne who commanded attention. Gone was any pretense of being a regular visitor. Her posture, her expression, her entire bearing now radiated the authority that Preston had spent the morning questioning. She moved with the confidence of someone who had just taken control of the situation completely. Deputy Warden Matthews, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor, I need you to assemble all administrative staff in the conference room immediately. Matthews looked nervously between Yvonne and Preston, unsure where his loyalty should lie in this rapidly evolving situation. Sir? He asked Preston, seeking guidance. Do what she says, Preston replied hoarsely. She's the Inspector General. The words hit Matthews like a physical blow. Everyone who worked in Ohio Corrections knew about the Inspector General. The position was legendary for its thorough investigations and career-ending reports. The fact that she was here in their facility, conducting an unannounced inspection, was every administrator's worst nightmare. "Yes, ma'am," Matthews said quickly. "Right away." As Matthews hurried off to gather the staff, Yvonne turned to Preston with the cool professionalism of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Warden Whitmore, I am placing you on immediate administrative leave pending the completion of this investigation." Preston's knees actually buckled slightly. Administrative leave was the kiss of death in state employment. It meant that the investigation had moved beyond fact-finding into formal disciplinary action. "The Inspector General, please," he began, but Yvonne held up a hand to stop him. "Captain Sterling, you are also placed on administrative leave effective immediately." Mason's face went from pale to completely white. "Ma'am, I was just following orders. The warden told us to—" "Captain Sterling, I strongly advise you to contact your union representative and arrange for legal counsel. The violations I witnessed today may have criminal implications beyond administrative discipline." The word criminal seemed to suck all the air out of the corridor. Mason stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. "Officer Jackson," Yvonne continued, "you will be interviewed as part of this investigation, but your cooperation this morning has been noted favorably." Jackson nodded frantically, clearly understanding that his honesty had likely saved his career. "Deputy Warden Matthews," Yvonne called as he returned with several confused-looking administrative staff members, "you are hereby designated as acting warden pending the appointment of interim leadership by the Department of Corrections." Matthews looked stunned. In the space of 5 minutes he had gone from deputy to acting warden, while his boss had gone from absolute authority to administrative exile. The administrative staff who had gathered were looking around nervously, clearly sensing that something monumental was happening, but not understanding the full scope of it yet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Yvonne addressed the group, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I am Inspector General Yvonne Sinclair, and I am conducting an unannounced compliance inspection of this facility. Effective immediately, this facility is under direct oversight by my office." The gasps and murmurs from the staff confirmed that they understood the gravity of the situation. Being placed under direct Inspector General oversight was the administrative equivalent of being put on life support. All current policies and procedures remain in effect unless specifically modified by my office. All staff members are required to cooperate fully with this investigation. Any attempt to obstruct, intimidate witnesses, or destroy documentation will result in immediate termination and potential criminal charges. She paused to let the implications sink in. "Acting Warden Matthews, I need access to all personnel files, complaint records, disciplinary actions, and administrative correspondence for the past 2 years. I also need a complete roster of all current staff members and their assignments." "Yes, ma'am," Matthews replied immediately. "Whatever you need." Preston, who had been standing silently through this entire exchange, finally found his voice again. "Inspector General, I understand that you need to complete your investigation, but I hope you'll allow me to—" "Warden Whitmore," Yvonne's voice cut through his attempt at negotiation like a blade, "you are no longer warden. You are a subject of this investigation. Any further communication from you should go through your legal representation." The finality of the statement was devastating. In the span of one morning, Preston had gone from being one of the most powerful men in Ohio corrections to being essentially unemployable in state government. "Security will escort you from the premises," Yvonne continued. "You have 15 minutes to collect personal items from your office under supervision." As Preston walked away, flanked by 2 guards who had been taking orders from him just hours earlier, the other staff members watched in stunned silence. The message was clear. No one was too powerful to fall, and the Inspector General's authority was absolute. These stories of accountability and justice reach people everywhere who believe in fairness and equality. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of truth are reaching across the globe. But this was only the beginning of their downfall. Over the next several hours, Riverside Correctional Facility was transformed from Preston Whitmore's personal kingdom into the subject of the most comprehensive investigation in Ohio corrections history. Yvonne worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, systematically dissecting every aspect of the facility's operations. The conference room had been converted into a command center, with boxes of files, computer printouts, and evidence materials covering every available surface. 3 additional investigators from the Inspector General's office had arrived within 2 hours of Yvonne's call, along with a team of forensic accountants and legal specialists. What we're seeing here, Yvonne explained to her team as they reviewed the initial findings, isn't just individual misconduct, it's systematic institutional discrimination that permeates every level of operations. Senior investigator David Chen nodded as he reviewed a stack of complaint files. The pattern is undeniable. 17 formal complaints in 18 months, but look at how they were handled. Every single one was either dismissed as unsubstantiated or resulted in minimal disciplinary action. And that's just the formal complaints, added legal specialist Sarah Rodriguez. I've been interviewing staff members, and the stories I'm hearing suggest that informal complaints and concerns were routinely ignored or actively discouraged. The scope of the investigation was expanding by the hour. What had started as a routine compliance inspection had uncovered evidence of discriminatory hiring practices, unequal disciplinary procedures, and a pattern of retribution against staff members who had raised concerns about the facility's culture. Acting Warden Matthews, who was proving to be far more cooperative than his predecessor, had provided unlimited access to personnel records and administrative files. The picture that emerged was damning. "Look at these disciplinary statistics," forensic accountant Michael Thompson said, spreading out a series of charts and graphs. Inmates of color receive disciplinary actions at twice the rate of white inmates for identical infractions. The disparities in punishment severity are even more stark. Yvonne studied the data with growing concern. "What about staff diversity? What does the employment picture look like?" "That's where it gets really interesting," Sarah replied, pulling out another set of files. "Of the 47 corrections officers employed here, only 12 are people of color. Of the 15 administrative positions, only 3 are held by non-white employees. And none of those 3 are in positions of significant authority." "And the promotion patterns?" Yvonne asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Exactly what you'd expect," David confirmed. In Preston's 8 years as warden, he promoted 17 people to supervisory positions. 16 of them were white males. The evidence was building into an overwhelming case of systematic discrimination that went far beyond the morning's incidents. But Yvonne knew that building the case was only half the battle. The real challenge would be implementing reforms that would prevent future abuses. "Sarah, I want you to start drafting a preliminary report for the governor's office," Yvonne instructed. "David, continue interviewing staff members and document every pattern of discriminatory conduct you can find. Michael, I need a complete financial analysis. I want to know if there are any budgetary irregularities that might be connected to the personnel issues." As her team scattered to continue their work, Yvonne took a moment to step outside the facility and collect her thoughts. The magnitude of what she had uncovered was staggering, but she also felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that justice was finally being served. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Governor DeWine's chief of staff. "Media getting wind of inspection. Need preliminary briefing ASAP." Yvonne sighed. The political implications of shutting down or fundamentally reforming a major state facility were enormous. But her job wasn't to make things easy for politicians. It was to ensure that Ohio's correctional system operated fairly and legally. She walked back inside to find Acting Warden Matthews waiting nervously by the conference room door. "Inspector General," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to help with this investigation. I know it probably looks bad that I didn't speak up earlier about some of the things that were happening here." Yvonne studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity versus political calculation. What she saw was genuine remorse and a desire to be part of the solution. "Mr. Matthews," she said, "the culture that allowed these problems to develop didn't happen overnight, and it's going to take sustained effort to change it. The question is whether you're prepared to be a leader in that change process." "I am," he replied firmly. "Whatever it takes." "Good. Because in about 6 hours, I'm going to be delivering a preliminary report to the governor that will recommend either fundamental reforms or complete administrative replacement. Your actions over the next few days will largely determine which recommendation I make." The weight of responsibility settled over Matthew's shoulders like a heavy coat. He was being given a chance to redeem not just himself, but the entire facility. "I won't let you down," he promised. "Don't make promises to me," Yvonne replied. "Make them to the 2,400 inmates who depend on this facility being run fairly and professionally." The full extent of the corruption was more shocking than anyone imagined. 3 weeks later, the transformation of Riverside Correctional Facility was so complete that it was barely recognizable as the same institution where Yvonne had been subjected to systematic discrimination. The changes weren't just cosmetic, they represented a fundamental restructuring of how the facility operated at every level. Governor Patricia DeWine had moved swiftly once she received Yvonne's preliminary report. Within 48 hours of the investigation's findings being delivered, Preston Whitmore had been officially terminated from state employment and was facing criminal charges for civil rights violations under federal law. Mason Sterling had also been terminated and was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the personnel changes were just the beginning. The governor had appointed Dr. Angela Washington, a nationally recognized corrections reform expert, as the new permanent warden. Dr. Washington, a black woman with a Ph.D. in criminal justice and 15 years of progressive corrections experience, represented everything that Preston had claimed people like her couldn't handle. "The culture change we're implementing here isn't just about policies and procedures," Dr. Washington explained to Yvonne during a follow-up inspection. "It's about fundamentally altering the power dynamics that allowed systematic discrimination to flourish." The results were already visible. New training programs on cultural competency and implicit bias had been implemented for all staff. A civilian oversight committee had been established with community representatives and family members of inmates. Most significantly, a new grievance system had been created that bypassed the facility's internal chain of command and reported directly to the Inspector General's office. "The most important change, Dr. Washington continued, is that we've shifted from a punishment-focused culture to a rehabilitation-focused one. Staff members now understand that their job isn't to dominate and control, but to facilitate positive change." Yvonne reviewed the statistical reports that documented the facility's transformation. Disciplinary disparities between white inmates and inmates of color had been virtually eliminated. Staff diversity had improved dramatically, with new hiring practices that actively recruited qualified candidates from underrepresented communities. Most telling of all, the number of complaints had dropped to zero, not because they were being suppressed, but because the conditions that generated them had been eliminated. "The federal investigation is also moving forward," Yvonne noted. "Preston is likely looking at significant jail time, and the Department of Justice has indicated they're considering a broader pattern and practice investigation of Ohio's entire correctional system." Dr. Washington nodded grimly. "Good. The problems at Riverside weren't unique. They were just more visible because of what happened to you. There are probably dozens of other facilities operating under similar cultures of discrimination." The ripple effects of the Riverside investigation were being felt throughout Ohio government. The governor had ordered comprehensive reviews of all state agencies, with particular attention to diversity, inclusion, and complaint handling procedures. Several other high-ranking officials had been quietly encouraged to seek early retirement, rather than face their own investigations. "You know what the most satisfying part of this whole situation is?" Yvonne asked as they walked through the facility's renovated visiting area. "What's that?" "Preston spent that entire morning trying to convince me that people like me don't have real authority, that we don't understand how institutions like this really work. But the truth is, it was his understanding that was fundamentally flawed." They paused in front of a new display case that showcased the facility's rehabilitation programs, job training, educational opportunities, family counseling services. It was a stark contrast to the intimidating, punishment-focused environment that had existed under Preston's leadership. "He thought authority meant domination," Yvonne continued. He thought leadership meant intimidation. He thought running a correctional facility meant breaking people down rather than building them up. And now, Dr. Washington asked, now we have a facility that actually serves its intended purpose, protecting public safety, while preparing people to successfully reintegrate into society. We have staff members who understand that their job is to serve the public, not to impose their personal prejudices. We have systems in place that ensure accountability and prevent future abuses. The conversation was interrupted by Acting Captain Rodriguez, formerly Officer Jackson, who approached with a clipboard of daily reports. "Inspector General," he said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be part of the solution here. The leadership training program has been incredibly valuable." Jackson's promotion was one of the most symbolically important changes at the facility. His willingness to speak honestly during the investigation had marked him as someone with integrity, and Dr. Washington had recognized that integrity by promoting him to a supervisory position. "Captain Rodriguez," Yvonne replied, "your courage in telling the truth that day helped save this entire facility. Don't ever underestimate the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." As they completed their tour, Yvonne reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed in just 3 weeks. Where there had once been fear and intimidation, there was now respect and professionalism. Where there had once been systematic discrimination, there were now systems designed to ensure equity and fairness. The changes that followed would affect the entire state. 6 months after that transformative Tuesday morning, Yvonne stood before a joint session of the Ohio General Assembly, delivering her annual report on the state of government accountability. The Riverside investigation had become a case study in how systematic discrimination could be identified, addressed, and prevented, not just in corrections, but across all state agencies. "The events at Riverside Correctional Facility," she told the assembled legislators, "represent both the worst and the best of state government. The worst because they demonstrated how unchecked authority and institutional prejudice can create environments where discrimination flourishes. The best because they showed that our systems of oversight and accountability, when properly implemented, can identify problems and create lasting solutions." The statistics she presented were remarkable. Complaints of discriminatory treatment across all Ohio correctional facilities had dropped by 73% in the 6 months following the Riverside reforms. Staff diversity had improved significantly, and employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture, but the impact had extended far beyond corrections. The governor had implemented Yvonne's recommendations for systematic bias training across all state agencies, created new pathways for reporting discrimination, and established an Office of Diversity and Inclusion with cabinet-level authority. "Perhaps most importantly," Yvonne continued, "we have demonstrated that change is possible when leadership has the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional culture." In the audience, Dr. Angela Washington sat with several other corrections officials who had been promoted to leadership positions as part of the systematic reforms. Captain Rodriguez, now Deputy Warden Rodriguez, was there representing the line staff who had embraced the cultural transformation. But the most significant attendee was Governor DeWine herself, who had made criminal justice reform one of the centerpieces of her administration following the Riverside investigation. "The Inspector General's work at Riverside," the governor had said in her State of the State address, "reminded us that true leadership means creating systems that serve all people fairly, regardless of their background or circumstances." The federal investigation had also concluded successfully. Preston Whitmore had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, while Mason Sterling had received 18 months. More importantly, the Department of Justice had worked with Ohio to implement a comprehensive reform agreement that would govern corrections operations for the next 5 years. As Yvonne concluded her legislative testimony, she reflected on the morning that had started it all. Her decision to continue with the inspection, despite the discriminatory treatment she received, had been vindicated beyond her wildest expectations. The personal cost had been significant. The stress of the investigation, the media attention, the political pressure from those who preferred the status quo. But the results had been transformational, not just for one facility but for an entire system. After the legislative session, Yvonne returned to her office to find a letter waiting on her desk. The return address showed it was from an inmate at Riverside, something that would have been unthinkable under Preston's regime, when any communication with outside authorities was heavily restricted and monitored. The letter was from Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old serving a 5-year sentence for drug offenses. He wrote, "Inspector General Sinclair, I wanted you to know that the changes at Riverside have given me hope for the first time since I've been incarcerated. The educational programs, the job training, the way the staff treats us with respect. It's all different now. I'm actually learning skills that will help me when I get out, instead of just surviving each day. My family says the visiting process is completely different too. They're treated like human beings instead of criminals. Thank you for having the courage to stand up for people like us." Letters like Marcus's had been arriving regularly, from inmates, family members, and staff who had all benefited from the cultural transformation at Riverside. Each one reminded Yvonne why her work mattered, why it was worth confronting discrimination, even when it was uncomfortable or politically difficult. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Washington. Federal inspection team just completed their 6-month follow-up. Perfect scores across all categories. Riverside is being held up as a national model for corrections reform. Yvonne smiled. The facility that had once been synonymous with discrimination and abuse was now being studied by corrections officials from across the country as an example of how to do things right. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was a personal one. The previous week, she had received word that the National Association of Inspector Generals had selected her for their Leadership in Government Accountability Award, recognizing not just the Riverside investigation, but her broader work in reforming state government. The award ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C., at a conference attended by oversight officials from all 50 states. Yvonne's presentation on the Riverside case would be the keynote address, sharing the lessons learned with hundreds of other investigators and reform advocates. As she prepared to leave the office that evening, Yvonne took one final look at the framed copy of her Inspector General credentials, the same credentials that Preston Whitmore had stared at in shock and disbelief 6 months earlier. The irony was still not lost on her. In trying to diminish her authority and question her qualifications, Preston had actually provided her with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate both. His prejudice had become the instrument of his own downfall and the catalyst for systematic change that would benefit thousands of people for years to come. Standing at her office window, looking out over the Columbus skyline, Yvonne reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from that difficult morning. Real authority doesn't come from the power to intimidate or discriminate. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right and the determination to create systems that serve justice for everyone. Thank you to everyone who typed respect during this powerful story, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything as we continue to share these incredible tales of courage and accountability. If these stories of justice and transformation inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us amplify more voices of truth and change. Until next time, keep believing in the power of standing up for what's right, no matter who tries to tell you that you don't belong.